You'll be shocked when you see the honors with which famous mobsters were buried.
Today, I'll tell you about my top 10 burials of criminal authorities from different countries.
And at the end of the video, you'll see perhaps a monument belonging to the most dangerous criminal of all that I've ever shown. Enjoy watching.
I've already told you before about the various graves of criminal authorities.
Then, in my list were perhaps the loudest names in the criminal world of the post-Soviet space. What are the monuments of the same Yaponchik, Otarik Vantrishvili, or a full-length monument of dead Hassan Worth? But personally, the huge granite statue of Rovshan Lenkaransky impressed me the most. By the way, if you want to learn more about their stories, you will always find a link in the description. So, for some reason, some people have the impression that such a tendency exists only in Russia, where notorious criminals were given the highest honors possible after their death. But you shouldn't think that way because, in reality, such cases are widespread all over the world. And I'm not just talking about countries that were part of the Soviet Union.
The thing is, such monstrous graves can be found literally in every country.
Personally, I was amazed that in modern Europe, which theoretically fights crime so hard, it still retains real works of art in its cemeteries. And these are all people with the most terrible past. Murderers, leaders of criminal groups who destroyed people by the thousands.
So I decided to prepare material for you, in which I will try to tell in detail about such burials.
By the way, at the end, I will show perhaps the best work of sculptors of all. I hope you like what I've prepared especially for you, and you appreciate my work with a like.
Well, my top opens with perhaps the most unremarkable grave of all that I will tell you about today, but far from the last criminal rests in it, and his name is Bugsy Siegel.
And this character, surely, was familiar to you before my story. The thing is, his image became the basis for many characters in modern films. For example, his biography formed the basis of the 1991 film Bugsy, and one of the last films in which this character participated was the series Boardwalk Empire.
Bugsy Siegel was born in a poor quarter of Brooklyn in 1906.
At that time, it was densely populated by various migrants, so he was not destined to have a peaceful and simple childhood. At a very young age, Bugsy joined a street gang that engaged in theft. Soon after that, he moved on to racketeering and was not averse to getting into fights.
In those days, he earned his nickname Bugsy for his extremely hot-tempered character and brief reflections.
If you delve deeper into this nickname, you can understand that it was a slang expression, "go bugs," which meant to lose one's mind. I think now you understand who this character is. Later, when Siegel grew up, he moved to New York, where he began to engage in car theft, and at the age of just 11, he became a hired killer. In general, the guy was a rebel from childhood. In those days, he got into the police several times, but he always managed to avoid punishment simply by paying a fine or bribing. But perhaps I won't dwell on this period of his life too much. After all, the story is really long. But in his youth, he managed to amass quite a substantial fortune.
After all, in 1937, he moved to California, where he lived in a huge mansion for a lot of money.
And he was quite popular with the ladies because he had a very handsome appearance. In general, the guy really rose from the bottom. Well, in the 40s, he moved to Las Vegas, where he decided to engage in the gambling business, and it was his undoing.
The story of Bugsy is really very cool and interesting, so I would dedicate a separate material to him if you, of course, want to. Write about it in the comments. Well, I'll continue.
In general, Bugsy quarreled with the mafia at one time, and they decided to eliminate him. He was expecting to meet with one person in his bungalow where they constantly held meetings, but it was not meant to be, as they sent a hitman after him. Through an open window, he fired several shots. The first one hit him in the head, the rest in the body. All the wounds were incompatible with life, so Bugsy Siegel died almost instantly. Almost in. No one came to the funeral of the famous gangster. Only a few relatives, even his closest associates, turned away from him. So the grave of a very famous and formidable criminal looks like this today. Simple, isn't it? But I believe that even such honors for this murderer are excessive, and even now such a grave looks quite good.
The next character may also already be familiar to you. This is Vincent Alo. One of the characters from the famous movie The Godfather was precisely based on him.
This man grew up in New York, and though you may think that this city is very attractive, in the 20s of the last century it was quite turbulent there. So, young Vincent began to engage in criminal activities from a very early age. He even ended up in prison at the age of 14. For what? Well, being a teenager, he committed an armed robbery. In general, also a bad guy. In 1926, Alo became a member of a very influential gang. In this position, he supervised the work of clubs, casinos, and other underground organizations. And I must say, he did it very, very well. The fact is that he opened 2 casinos and did not encounter any pressure from the government or law enforcement agencies at all. And that means the mafia had absolutely no costs from this business. A valuable employee, isn't he? But his biography is not as colorful as that of the previous character, and this allowed him to live to a very advanced age. Vincent Alo retired in the 1970s, and for a whole 30 years he lived a peaceful retirement life. Alo died in 2001 at the age of 96.
His remains were buried in the Bronx, and I want to tell you, his grave, though not super monstrous, looks very, very cool. It even became a kind of attraction of the local cemetery. See for yourself. The next character was born not just in the last century, but way back in 1884, and his name was Joseph Leonardo.
He grew up in a very large family with 3 brothers and a sister, and until he was 15, he lived with his family in the secluded Sicilian town of Licata. By the way, this town has now developed quite nicely and can be confidently called a resort. The views there are simply breathtaking.
In 1901, he moved to New York and lived in the Little Italy neighborhood.
There, for many years, he developed his business selling fruits, and later he opened his own pastry shop. By the way, only after some time did his brothers come to him, and it was with them that he formed his first gang. Honest business brought very little money, so the guys decided to turn to crime. They engaged in extortion and robberies. However, this story begins in Cleveland. In those days, he and his gang, consisting of brothers, committed quite a few crimes. He even managed to get into prison for knife wounds. After his release, he was also arrested for robbery, but he did not go to jail. After that, he shot a man during an argument, but he was also acquitted. And then he was suspected of a double murder. But even then, there was no punishment. Strange coincidence, isn't it?
But then something happened that fundamentally changed Leonardo's life. In 1919, Prohibition began.
According to it, alcohol sales were prohibited in the country, and that's exactly why he amassed a huge fortune. He sold corn, sugar, and yeast from underground moonshine production. And besides, he began to squeeze out all the business under his control, threatening those who disagreed with reprisals. In general, Joseph became a real sugar baron, and he lived his whole life like this, managing his own gang. Joseph Leonardo was prepared for his death, and even carried his will with him, and he never parted with his bodyguards. But one day he went to the barbershop only with his brother after a strange call. That's where he was shot by hitmen from a rival mafia. Leonardo died in 1927.
Several hundred mourners gathered at his funeral, many of them from other cities, and this event also led to significant consequences. But again, this is a huge story that I can tell you in another video, and here is his grave. In general, during Prohibition in America, crime flourished very much. And as you could understand, it was smuggling alcohol that brought almost the most money at that time. So I couldn't pass by the story of this person, Dutch Schultz.
This man was one of the most successful gangsters in the USA, and he operated precisely at that time, Dutch way. He was born in 1902. From an early age, he began to help his family with money because his father owned a stable and his mother was a laundress. It seemed like a wealthy father, so life was provided. But he left the family when the boy was only 4 years old. So Schultz joined a gang and became a burglar. And this guy actually remembered by many. How?
Well, for example, he had a very bad temper. Even his closest henchmen he paid small money, not to mention someone from the outside.
For this, almost no one liked him. His acquaintances say that Dutch had only a couple of pants and a cheap suit. And this is considering that by those times he was a millionaire. Yes, even among mobsters there are misers. But his lawyer spoke differently. He was quite tolerant. Push his girlfriend. Nothing scary, spit in his face, all the same. But if you stole even a coin from his pocket, you would be a corpse. In general, that's how he lived, not spending his fortune. He also had a bunch of crimes, robberies, racketeering, murders. In general, a whole bouquet, but still, even such a significant figure was decided to be eliminated by none other than his associates.
The thing is, Schultz had long planned to murder a prosecutor who was bothering him. The gang believed that this would lead to inevitable consequences that would ruin the organization, but he ignored them. And for this, he was killed.
When Schultz was sitting with his closest people in a restaurant, 2 strangers entered. They opened fire. 3 of Schultz's friends died on the spot. He himself died in the hospital the next day. His grave is located in one of the cemeteries in New York, and it looks very cool. How do you like it?
Do you know who Al Capone was afraid of? Nope. This famous mobster was utterly fearless. Not even thousands of people from other gangs and mafia groups scared him. But there was still one person, the only person on Earth, whom the famous Al Capone genuinely feared. Who was it? Jaime Weiss.
This man was born in 1898 in Poland, and when he was 3 years old, he moved to America with his parents. As a teenager, Jaime was a troublemaker. However, at first, his career didn't take off. Once, during a burglary, he knocked over a shelf with perfumes, which led the police to nickname him the Perfume Burglar. Interesting nickname, isn't it? But what happened next was much more interesting. You see, this man came up with a way to kill anyone as discreetly as possible, the so-called one-way ride. It's when a person gets behind the wheel of a car while killers wait for them in the back seat.
Yes, that same trick from the movies was invented by this guy. But his biography is so extensive that we won't dwell on it. It's enough to know that even Al Capone was afraid of this guy. Instead, let me tell you the story of his death, because it's like a whole movie.
So he arrived with his henchmen at his headquarters, where several hitmen were waiting for him. Weiss died on the spot, but his friends managed to avoid instant death. They say these people managed to rush out of the building and almost disappear. They were killed on the other side of the street.
So it was a whole mafia shootout reminiscent of cool blockbusters. This happened in 1926.
Weiss was buried in a cemetery in Hillside. It's the same place where Al Capone himself was buried. Ironical, isn't it? Well, here's his grave. A huge granite mausoleum. Looks really cool.
Well, it's time for me to wrap up, but I promise to show you many very interesting and cool monuments to various gangsters. So let me tell you about them briefly.
This is a very interesting mausoleum that was erected in honor of the deceased Sam Giancana. This person is interesting because he first led a very cool organization that operated in Chicago, and then he sided with the CIA. He had a hand in the assassination of Fidel Castro. This grave is dedicated to Mike Merlo. He was the head of one of the gangster groups, as well as a fixer associated with the same Chicago organization. The next mausoleum was built in honor of Johnny Torrio. This guy played an important role in the same organization before Al Capone's time, and then became the right hand of Lucky Luciano. He's also a very famous mobster, by the way.
And here lies Tommy Galliano. The man was known for discreetly leading a group for 2 decades, which later became one of the most influential in New York.
And the last grave belongs to Antonio Lombardo. He was the president of the Sicilian Mafia Union, and also the right hand of Al Capone. In general, another influential guy.
Which grave of famous mobsters did you like the most? Share your thoughts in the comments.
Personally, I think the mausoleum of Antonio Lombardo is very cool, because what the sculptors did with granite is at the highest level of professionalism. You know where else professionals are needed? In our team. Friends, you have the opportunity to join our team. If you have skills in video editing, can voice videos in Russian, English, and other languages, or write interesting scripts, we'll be happy to work with you. Write to the Telegram bot, the link is in the description. And thank you for watching.